Hi folks, I just wanted to take a few minutes to make a couple of videos regarding the cases for SECRA. Okay, so basically it's to just go over some things and make sure that everybody's on the same page. All right, so this first case, this is the one regarding, let's see, here it is, watch this. Okay, so let me just tell you a little bit about what happened here. Watch this, it was actually a different name, but myself and a partner owned a watch kiosk in South Florida, and it was very successful. And we sold some high-end watches like Breitling, Movado, Bulova, things like this, some more expensive watches. And we also sold a lot of watches that appealed to international folks. So in South Florida, you had people traveling from all over the world. Okay. So we carried a lot of brands that were popular in Europe and things like this, like Skagen, and there's some other ones as well that are listed in here. Okay. Now we were doing very well, and then we were at Sawgrass Mills Mall, and that was in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and we were invited to go ahead and open up the same type of business in Dallas, Texas. Okay, it was actually in what's called the Grapevine Mills Mall, but I call it the Dallas Mills Mall in this particular story, hiding the names. In any event, what wound up happening is we went out there and opened up the business, and essentially what we did was we duplicated what we had done in South Florida. However, what we didn't know, or we didn't understand, we didn't take the time. We figured if we were successful there, we would be successful in Dallas. The problem was the customers were different. For example, in South Florida, we had so many international customers. The first thing in talking to them, and it was something we didn't realize when we had done this, was that if a person from England was coming and they bought, or from China or from any other foreign country, and they bought a Breitling or they bought a Movado watch, for them, they were concerned with two items. The two items that they were concerned with, one, is it an original product, not a copy? That was their primary concern. And the second one had to do with the price. Was it a good price for them compared to what they could get it for at home or someplace else? Now, we had very good pricing. So most of the time, we were probably 10% below any of our competitors. And the funny thing was, or the interesting thing that we didn't realize, was that for the international customers that we dealt with in South Florida, they knew that once they bought the watch, if they had an issue, they were going to be contacting Movado or Breitling directly. Now that's a different behavior from what happens in the American market. In the American market, or in the US market, if you're buying something like an expensive watch, and you bought it at a jewelry store, and you ran into some kind of trouble, the American customer is very likely to go right back to that jewelry store and bring it in there and get their assistance in getting it fixed. And I think this is probably the biggest mistake that we made. So what wound up happening was that instead of selling this wide variety of watches, that from international and more expensive watches, when we were in Dallas, what wound up happening was the customers were not interested. They would come and look at the more expensive watches, but then we found they would go to another store, and even though they were paying a little bit more, they would buy them at the other store. And the reason why was because we were a kiosk and not a regular inline store. In other words, a kiosk is one of the big things you see like in the center of the mall. They're not like a regular type store. They were afraid we were only there temporarily, or that we wouldn't be there in case they ran into any trouble. So they would go and pay more money for the identical watch, right, to make sure that they had somebody they could rely on. That was one problem. The second problem was a lot of the watches that we carried were very fashionable. Let me see if I can find the names in here. So let's see here. Here's some of the names. Okay, so we carried like Movado, Breitling, Tag Heuer. These are the more expensive watches. And then here, these are the ones, so let me just highlight that. Oops. these guys right here, right? So these are the ones that they would come and take a look at, but then go buy somewhere else. And then these are some of the international watches: Swatch, Baume & Mercier, Skagen. And for whatever reason, then the people would come and look at them, but they weren't interested. And we had very good pricing on these items. Okay, so basically, notice they were interested in buying watches that were less than $250, and this was a problem for us. Okay, because it wasn't what we expected at all. Okay, so at the end of the day, we had to decide, was this what we wanted to do? Okay, was this the type of business we wanted to do? And part of the reason why we did it was so that we could, besides having a good business, so that we could order even more product, get even better pricing. The problem was, a lot of the product we were looking to improve our pricing on, the American customers weren't interested in. And the problem is, the other watches that they were buying from us had very little margin on them, very little profit, and everybody carried them. You know, Seiko, Timex, the Citizen, the lower end Citizen watches. Everybody carried them, so the competition there was very big. Where for Movado, Breitling, Tag, and for these other international watches, we didn't have a lot of competition. So it kind of hurt our whole process for being there. Now, ultimately, what we did, once we went there, Rami and myself, once we went there, and by the way, the names have been changed. In this scenario here, I'm Robert, and Rami was actually the name of my partner, but different last name. But anyway, the bottom line was, after we figured out what was going on, the question was, what do we want to do with this business? It's not really serving the purpose that we wanted. We didn't want to shut it down. Everybody would wind up losing their jobs. The guy John, that wasn't actually his name, but it's close. He was doing a good job. It was just we had made some mistakes. Ultimately, what happened was John was able to help through some family get some financing. So ultimately, what we did was we worked with John to have him take over the business. This way, the employees still kept their jobs, the business stayed open, and John was able to run it as his own. You know, as he bought it from us. Okay. And what we did was we took the merchandise, the Movados and all that they weren't interested in, we took that back with us to South Florida, and then basically he ran it as a kiosk that sold watches up to about $250. Okay? So ultimately, that's what happened. That's the actual happening in this story right here. Okay? So I just wanted to explain to you exactly what was going on. Okay? All right. So that's the first video. This is just about the front end of the paper, what actually happened. I want to explain to you exactly what happened. Okay. Now the story, the front part of the story here that I've written, we can go in later on and tweak it. I wrote it rather quickly to make sure I got this to you, but this is the essence of what happened. Okay. All right. I'm going to be back in just a minute because now I want to go over the teaching notes for this case. Okay. Be back in a minute. Bye-bye.